under the blazing noon sun on a deserted road. A CEO's car suddenly breaks down. Frustrated and tense about being late for an important meeting, he grows impatient. Then, out of nowhere, a black female mechanic stops to help him. But instead of showing gratitude, he looks at her with disdain. It all seems over until he notices the sapphire ring on her finger. That ring carries a secret that will leave them both stunned. Before finding out what happens next, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of this story. It was a blistering afternoon in the middle of nowhere. The sun hung high in the sky, beating down on the long stretch of empty highway like a fiery hammer. The asphalt shimmered, warping the distant horizon, making everything appear as if it were slowly melting away. Not a tree in sight, just heat. And a sleek silver Maserati quattraport stalled in the middle of the road, its engine sputtering and belching thick white smoke. James Carter sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The air inside the car felt thick, oppressive, suffocating. He slammed his fist against the wheel, cursing under his breath. He wasn't used to this. He was used to controlling everything: his life, his empire, his world. But this was beyond his control. The only thing he could control now was his rising panic. James stepped out of the sleek Maserati quattraport, his polished shoes clicking against the hot pavement. At 32 years old, he was the embodiment of modern success, tall, well-built, and impeccably groomed. His sharp, angular jawline and piercing blue eyes exuded confidence, while his perfectly tailored suit clung to his frame as if it had been custom-made to showcase his wealth. Every detail about him, from the designer cufflinks to the expensive leather briefcase in his hand, screamed power and control. But that perfect appearance right now, means nothing. His platinum Swiss watch flashed under the sunlight. 11:43 a.m. It hit him like a punch to the gut. In 17 minutes, he was supposed to be at a billion-dollar strategy meeting with investors that could decide the future of his company, the future of his legacy. And here he was, helpless. Sweat began to bead down his neck, soaking through his shirt. He yanked open the hood of the car, and thick plumes of smoke shot up into his face. He took a step back, his heart pounding, his mind racing. What the hell was he going to do? This wasn't a boardroom, and the rules here didn't work the same way. James ran a multinational empire, made decisions that shaped industries, but now, standing alone in the heat with a car that wouldn't start and no one around to help, he was just another man struggling with the unexpected. Just then, the rumbling sound of an engine interrupted his frantic thoughts. A rusty old Ford F-150 appeared in the distance, moving slowly, the engine sputtering as it too seemed to struggle against the oppressive heat. The truck pulled over beside him, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust as it came to a stop. The door creaked open, and out stepped Kimberly Harris, a woman whose presence immediately commanded attention. Her dark brown skin glistened under the harsh sun, her curly hair tied back into a practical bun that spoke of long hours spent working hard. She wasn't here for pleasantries. She was here to solve a problem. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of working with tools, rested on the edge of the truck door as she climbed out. She stood tall and confident, wearing a faded oil-stained work shirt and a pair of well-worn jeans that clung to her athletic frame. She looked like she belonged to this world of grease and metal, the complete opposite of James, who was dressed in a finely tailored suit, drenched in sweat, looking every bit the polished corporate air. Kim looked him over as if she was assessing a car engine, evaluating unbothered, unfazed. She crossed her arms, taking in the sight of the luxury car that now sat broken on the side of the road. "Car's broken," she asked flatly, her voice thick with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. James blinked, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't used to people like her, people who didn't defer to him, people who didn't know who he was. "You're sure you know how to fix cars?" The question escaped before he could stop it, his tone dripping with doubt. He didn't mean for it to sound dismissive, but it did. A woman, a black woman dressed like she worked with her hands, standing here in front of him, offering help. What did she know about luxury cars like his? Kim didn't flinch. She didn't even bat an eye. She simply walked over, opened the hood, and leaned in, inspecting the engine with a practiced eye. Within moments, she nodded to herself, then stood back up. Cooling system's busted, she said flatly, almost matter-of-factly. You've got about 5 minutes before you start it up again and the engine's toast. You're lucky it didn't overheat. James stood frozen, his mouth agape. Lucky? How was it lucky that he was stuck out here with his multi-million-dollar car broken down in the middle of nowhere? His pride was taking a hit, and he couldn't figure out why this woman, this stranger, had such control over him. His mind raced. His usual thoughts, strategies, numbers meetings flooded in, but they felt distant. His world had always been one of certainty, of order, of power. Yet here he was, unsure, vulnerable feeling. Weak. As Kim worked her hands, moving quickly and efficiently to fix what she could, James couldn't help but watch. He wasn't interested in her skills, though they were impressive, but there was something about her, something that dug under his skin, something that unsettled him. Kim wiped her hands on a rag, then turned to him. She glanced at him, her gaze firm. "I'll get you back on the road," she said, but her tone held a quiet finality. "But it's temporary. You've got about 2 hours before it'll overheat again. After that, you'll need a mechanic." James, still reeling from the strange sensation of being helped by this woman, pulled out his wallet, instinctively reaching for a few $100 bills. He extended them toward her, trying to restore some semblance of control to this situation. But when he glanced at her hand, his stomach dropped. A glint of sunlight reflected off something small, metallic, something familiar. It was a silver ring, the band thin, but the sapphire stone unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized it. The ring. His mother's ring, the one he had slipped into his pocket when he was 10, a token of a promise made to a little girl in an orphanage, a promise he had never kept. He had given it to her, promising he would return. His eyes locked on the sapphire ring on Kim's finger, and the years between then and now seemed to collapse in on him. "Where did you get that ring?" he asked, his voice hoarse, a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't look away. Kim hesitated for a moment, her hand instinctively closing around the ring as though shielding it from his gaze. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice steady, though there was something guarded beneath it. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer anything more. James was frozen, the world around him spinning. This was impossible. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but his mind couldn't form the words. This woman, Kim, was the same little girl he had made a promise to all those years ago, the girl he had forgotten, the one he had abandoned. He stood there speechless, his heart heavy with guilt and confusion. The world around him felt off balance, as if everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. Kim stepped back, pushing the money into her pocket without looking at him. She turned, heading back to her truck. Her footsteps were firm, resolute. She wasn't interested in his confusion. She wasn't interested in his apologies. She had her own path. "If your car breaks down again, head into Florida City," she called back to him over her shoulder. "My shop's just behind the old wooden sign." James stood there watching her disappear into the distance, his mind swirling. Who was she really? What had just happened? He looked down at his hands, the $100 bills still clutched tightly in his grasp. This wasn't just a broken car. This was something far deeper, something that had been buried long ago, only to resurface now. He had just crossed paths with someone who knew the truth about him, and he had no idea how deep that truth ran. The sun hung low over the town of Florida, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. It had been a few days since Kim had crossed paths with James Carter, and the weight of their brief interaction lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting wasn't just a chance encounter, it was a turning point. At home, Kim stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of stew. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, but even the comfort of cooking couldn't quiet the storm brewing inside her. Kim had spent years watching James Carter from afar. She had seen the headlines, read the articles, and witnessed the rise of the Carter empire. Every time she saw his face on the news, the memories came flooding back. The promise he had made, the hope he had sparked in her, and the bitter reality of being abandoned. Her hatred for James had grown over the years, fed by the absence of answers, the emptiness that had been left behind when he disappeared from her life. But there was more to her anger now. It wasn't just about being abandoned as a child. It was about the lives that had been destroyed in the process. James's family, particularly his father, David Carter, had done far more than simply ignore her childhood. They had torn apart her family, her mother's legacy, and her sense of self. Kim's fingers gripped the wooden spoon tighter, her knuckles whitening as she thought about the years of pain she had endured. Her mother Imani had been forced into hiding after David Carter's real estate dealings crushed their family's land, and Kim had been left to fend for herself in a world that had never cared about her. It wasn't just abandonment, it was systematic erasure. David Carter had stolen everything from her, and James was complicit whether he knew it or not. She had been working on this for years, gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle of her past. Kim had meticulously tracked every move the Carter family made, every business deal, every shady transaction, and every unethical action they took. She knew how to get the truth. She knew how to uncover the lies that hid behind the power of the Carter name. And now she was ready to bring it all to light. As she stared out the window, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. It was Luther Thompson, her uncle. Luther had been her rock when everything else had crumbled. He had taken her in when her mother had disappeared, raised her like his own daughter, and always kept a watchful eye on her, especially after her mother's mysterious vanishing. At 55, Luther was a man of few words, but his presence was enough to calm anyone. He was tall, solid, with a quiet strength about him, a man who had seen more than his fair share of hardship. His graying beard and weathered hands spoke of a lifetime of hard work, but his eyes, sharp and knowing, spoke of the secrets he kept. Kim opened the door and smiled despite the weight in her chest. "Uncle Luther," she greeted, stepping aside to let him in. "Evening, Kim," he replied, his deep voice carrying a certain calmness. "What's on your mind?" "Just thinking," Kim said, wiping her hands on the towel. She motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table. "Thinking about James." Luther's eyes narrowed slightly, his weathered hands resting on the edge of the table. He'd known about the bitterness Kim carried for James, and he understood why. But he also knew that Kim had never allowed herself to fully confront the depth of that pain until now. It was clear from her tone that something had shifted in her. "Let's not rush into things," Luther said, settling into his chair. "What do you plan to do?" Kim paused, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm going to confront him." Luther nodded slowly. He knew Kim well enough to understand that once her mind was set on something, there was no turning back. But he also knew the stakes. He knew what it would mean if Kim followed through with her plan to expose the Carters, what it would mean for her, for Naomi, and for the fragile peace they had managed to build in the years since Imani's disappearance. "You know what this will cost you, right?" Luther's voice was quieter now, but it carried weight. Kim looked down at the stew bubbling on the stove, the steam rising in gentle waves. "I don't care anymore. I've been living in the shadow of their lies for too long. I need to see it all come down." Luther didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, his niece, a woman who had grown up strong and resilient despite everything life had thrown at her. He had always known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. "You'll need proof," Luther said after a long pause, his voice steady, but with a hint of concern. "Real proof, not just rumors and whispers." Kim nodded. She had already begun gathering the documents, the contracts, the land deeds, the shady dealings hidden in the Carter family's history. But there was one thing she hadn't counted on James. She had been following his every move for years, but now, after their unexpected meeting, she realized just how much he didn't know. James was as much a victim of his father's manipulation as she was a man who had been groomed to take control of an empire without ever being told the truth about what had been built on lies and blood. But that didn't change what Kim needed to do. She couldn't let him off the hook. She couldn't allow him to be a pawn in his father's game, even if he didn't understand the full extent of what had happened. Kim felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Confronting James would be just the beginning. There was no turning back after that. "I've been tracking every move James makes for years," Kim said, her voice hardening. "The Carters think they've covered their tracks, but I've found their mistakes. Every shady deal, every unlawful transaction, I'm going to bring them down." Luther's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Just make sure you know what you're walking into. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about Naomi too. You need to think about her future." Naomi Harris, at only 12 years old, had grown up faster than most children her age. The quiet strength she carried was a reflection of everything her mother had endured and everything Naomi had learned to do in order to protect her. From the very beginning, Naomi had understood the weight of her mother's pain. She had never asked about her father. It wasn't because she didn't wonder every child has a right to know their roots, But because she knew deep down that asking would only bring her mother sorrow, Kim had been deceived and betrayed by a man on a stormy night. He had left the very next morning. Kim was heartbroken, reminiscing about the memories from when she was at the orphanage. That man had once sworn undying love to her, giving her a ring with a sapphire stone and promising that he would return. She believed him, trusted him unconditionally. She waited for him for so long, but never received any hope. James disappeared without a trace, and that was the final nail in the coffin for Kim's trust in anyone. Returning to that stormy night, her heart was crushed again when betrayed for the second time. Unfortunately, she found out that she was pregnant afterward, but she had no intention of abandoning the baby. It was her child, a gift from heaven, or so she thought. In that moment, she realized that she would have to be independent, strong, and self-reliant to be a mother, a single mother. She had learned to trust only herself. As a result, Naomi had grown up with a sense of quiet independence that was beyond her years. She didn't complain when her mother worked late, often into the night, or when their modest home lacked the luxuries that other families had. Naomi knew that life wasn't about what you had, but about what you could give, what you could share. And Kim shared everything with her love strength and the quiet promise to never give up, no matter the odds. Naomi, wise beyond her years, understood that her mother's love wasn't just an instinct, it was a choice made after years of struggle and pain. She knew that her mother had been scarred by the past and had become the fortress around their small family, and Naomi had quietly accepted that. She was the silent strength beside Kim, the one who held her mother's hand when times got tough, the one who learned early on how to take care of herself because her mother had never asked for help. Despite the absence of her father, Naomi had never felt neglected. Kim made sure of that. She filled the emptiness with everything she could offer, a love so fierce, so unconditional, it left no room for any voids to remain. Back to reality, Kim swallowed hard the weight of his words, settling deep in her chest. Naomi was her world. She would never do anything to put her daughter in harm's way, but the road ahead was fraught with danger. And Kim knew she was about to step into a storm that could destroy everything if she wasn't careful. Meanwhile, across town, James sat in his high-rise office staring out at the city below. The images of his father's empire, the Carter Global logo shining on buildings, on the backs of countless employees, on the faces of investors, all felt empty now. He had tried to avoid it, the sinking feeling in his chest, every time he saw Kim's face flash in his memory. He had tried to push the thought of the little girl he had once promised to return to out of his mind. But now that promise had resurfaced stronger than ever, and it weighed on him more than he could admit. His mind kept returning to the ring, the sapphire that had once held so much meaning between them. Why hadn't he kept his promise? He had never known the full extent of what had happened. How could he? His father had shielded him from it all, hid the truth like a dark secret buried deep in the family's foundation. But now there was something stirring in him, a sense of guilt, an unease that he couldn't explain. The ring was calling to him. Kim was calling to him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. And for the first time in his life, he was beginning to question the empire he had inherited. As Kim sat with Luther plotting her next move, the world around her seemed to close in. The battle for her family's legacy was about to begin, and she would stop at nothing to make sure the truth was exposed. She would make sure James knew the full extent of his family's crimes, whether he was ready to face it or not. This was the start of something far greater than any of them could understand. The past was coming back to claim what had been stolen, and neither Kim nor James would ever be the same again. The sky was clouded with tension, as if the universe itself held its breath. Kim had waited for this moment for years, carefully, patiently, methodically. And now she was finally face to face with James Carter, the man who had unknowingly become both the key to unlocking her past and the barrier to her future. Kim had reached out to James first. She had not made it clear what the meeting was about, only that she needed to see him. Kim had driven herself hard for this day. Every detail had been meticulously planned. She had gathered documents read through endless files and compiled a mountain of evidence that would once and for all expose the Carter family's crimes. And now, here she was sitting in this dingy cafe waiting to face him. She could almost taste the bitterness in the air, the injustice, the years of resentment she had kept buried inside her. She wasn't just here to expose James's ignorance about his father's crimes. She was here to destroy the carefully constructed image of a man who had never once cared to see beyond his own privilege. A door opened. Kim's heart skipped a beat. It was James. He stepped inside the cafe, his sharp suit and confident posture almost too out of place for this modest setting. But Kim knew the man well. He had spent years standing on a pedestal, looking down at the rest of the world. Now, as he walked toward her, there was a certain hesitance in his step. He could sense something was wrong. Kim kept her gaze fixed on him, her eyes steely, unreadable. He took a seat across from her, his expression still one of polished control, but she saw the flicker of curiosity and something deeper beneath his calm facade. "You don't know me," she began, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "But I've known you, James. I've known everything about you for years." James raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. He just sat there staring at her, trying to read her, trying to understand the storm that seemed to be building within her. Kim's eyes locked onto his, her gaze sharp and cold like a blade ready to strike. Her breath was shallow, the air in her lungs feeling too tight, too suffocating. She opened the folder she had brought with her, the folder that held everything, every truth, every lie, every piece of evidence that had taken her years to collect. She let it fall onto the table with a hard slap. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet cafe. Asterisk, bam, asterisk. The noise startled James, and his eyes snapped to the folder, then to Kim, but he didn't move. He couldn't move. Not yet. Kim's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that it felt as if the sound was all she could hear. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made everything else fade into the background. The years of pain, the years of questions that had no answers, the years of waiting for justice, all of it came rushing forward in this single moment. Her voice was low at first, almost a whisper, but it was heavy with the weight of everything she had been carrying inside. "Do you remember the ring?" she asked, each word like a punch to his chest. Her voice wasn't sweet. It wasn't kind. It was razor sharp, cutting through the air between them. James's brow furrowed, his lips tightened, his expression hardening. "The ring," he repeated, his voice clipped. Kim leaned forward, eyes boring into his. "The one with the sapphire. The one you gave to a little girl in the orphanage. The one you promised to come back for." Her eyes burned with a fury that had been simmering for so long she thought she might combust if she didn't release it now. James blinked, the briefest flicker of recognition flashing across his face, but he quickly masked it with that same cold, unfeeling exterior. "What does that have to do with anything?" he asked, though his voice lacked the confidence it had moments ago. Kim could feel the hesitation. Kim felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. Anger, hot, searing, burned in her chest, but she fought to keep her voice steady. "It has everything to do with everything," she said, her words biting sharp as glass. She slid the folder closer to him, the papers inside rustling, as if they too were desperate to be seen, to be heard. Kim could feel her hands shaking, but she didn't care. She had to do this. She had to make him understand. "My mother, Imani Harris, didn't die in a car accident. She didn't die, James. She was forced to disappear." Her words struck like a thunderclap. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted, the temperature seemed to drop, and the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them. The anger, the pain, the betrayal, it all poured out of her in that one moment. James recoiled as if she had slapped him, his expression faltering for the first time. His eyes darted to the papers she had laid out in front of him, but he couldn't seem to process them. His jaw clenched as though he was fighting to push away the truth, to reject it. That's impossible," he muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You're lying." Kim's eyes flared with a fire that made her almost glow with the heat of it. Her entire being trembled with the weight of the truth she was forcing him to face. "I'm not lying," she spat. "Your father, David Carter, made sure of it. He made her disappear. He made sure no one knew the truth about what happened to her." Kim leaned in even closer, now her voice like ice. "David Carter stole our land, our future, and erased my mother from this world so he could have it all." She was shaking now, but it wasn't fear. It was rage. Rage that had been building for years, rage that had been carefully hidden behind a wall of grief and silence. But now it was bursting from her like a flood, unstoppable. She pushed the folder aside, pulling out a sheet of paper, the forged death certificate. She slammed it onto the table with such force that the papers fluttered around it, the sound like the cracking of a whip. "There. Do you see it now?" Kim demanded. "Do you see what your father did? He destroyed my family, James, and you are a part of it." James's face drained of color as his eyes scanned the document, his expression falling into one of disbelief. He was shaking now, his fingers curling into tight fists. For the first time in his life, he felt out of control. The carefully constructed world he had built around himself, the world of power and prestige, was crumbling before his eyes. "I didn't know," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. It was almost a plea, desperate, fragile. "I didn't know any of this." Kim's eyes flashed with a pain so raw it was almost unbearable. She could see the confusion in his eyes, but she had no sympathy left for him. The truth was too heavy for that. "You didn't know," she repeated, her voice rising with the weight of her fury. "Of course you didn't. Your father made sure you didn't know. He kept you blind, James. He made you a puppet, and you—" Her voice cracked with emotion, but she quickly regained control, her eyes cold as ice. "You let it happen. You let it happen." James stumbled back in his chair, the weight of her words hitting him like a freight train. He wanted to say something, anything, to make sense of it, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. He had no defense. Kim stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh, grating noise. She was a force now, a woman who had spent her life bearing her pain, only to let it spill out with a ferocity that couldn't be contained. "Your father did more than just steal from us, James. He buried us. He erased us. And now I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what it cost me, what it cost my family." Kim said, her voice cold and final. "This isn't just about revenge. This is about justice." Kim's eyes bored into him one last time, her heart pounding as if it might break free from her chest. She had said everything she needed to say. She had given him the truth, and now it was up to him to decide what he would do with it. She turned to leave her steps confident and firm, and then, without turning back, she spoke over her shoulder, her voice like a low growl. "I'm not here to make you feel better, James. I'm here to make sure the truth comes to light, and you're going to help me do that, whether you like it or not." As Kim walked out of the cafe, the door closing softly behind her, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the beginning of something much bigger, something she had waited for her entire life. For the first time, she felt like the world had been tilted on its axis. The battle for justice had begun, and no one, not even James Carter, could stop it now. James sat in the dimly lit cafe long after Kim had stormed out, her words echoing in the stillness. The air felt colder now, pressing in on him, as if the very space around him had tightened, suffocating him. The weight of the documents in front of him, the forged death certificate, the stolen land deeds, the lies his father had built their entire empire on, felt like a boulder crushing him from the inside out. His hands trembled slightly, and he clenched them into fists on the table, as if trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But the control he had prided himself on for years had slipped away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time in his life, powerless. His suit, once immaculate, now seemed ill-fitting, a symbol of the man he had once been, strong in charge, untouched by the world around him. Now it hung on him like a costume, a disguise that had never fit the man he was becoming. James's face was pale, drained of the usual color that marked his authority. His jaw was tight, his lips pressed together in a thin, angry line. But the anger wasn't at Kim. It was at himself. He couldn't stop the flood of guilt and confusion that was now overtaking him. Every memory he had tried to push down was surfacing, each one shattering the perfect image he had created of himself. His mind raced, unable to find any anchor. He was still stuck on Kim's final words, her voice cutting through him like shards of glass. "You're a part of it." He didn't want to be a part of it. The man she described his father, the one who had orchestrated the destruction of her family, wasn't the man James had grown up admiring. He wasn't the man who had been his father. Wasn't he supposed to have known all along James had trusted Carter, trusted the father who had promised him power control and everything he ever wanted? But now that very trust felt like a betrayal. His mind drifted back to the memories of the orphanage, the flash of a little girl's face that he couldn't quite place the ring he had given her. He thought it was a gesture, a promise of hope. But it was nothing more than a lie, wasn't it? That promise to come back had been a hollow one broken long ago. Kim was the girl he had forgotten and the girl he had been told to forget. James's hands found their way to his face, and he rubbed his temples as if to clear the fog. His head throbbed, the tension in his skull growing unbearable. The weight of the revelation pressed on him like a vice. He hadn't known. He hadn't known what his father had done, what his legacy truly was. But now that he knew, there was no unknowing. The floodgates had opened, and he couldn't close them again. He stared at the papers Kim had left behind his eyes, flicking between the land deeds and the forged certificate, his mind running in circles. The walls around him felt like they were closing in. What now? What could he do now that everything he had believed and everything he had worked for was built on deceit? He thought of his position, his company, the millions he controlled, the luxury, the power. All of it felt worthless now. He had been a pawn manipulated by his father, his own ignorance and blind trust betraying him. And now he felt trapped. James stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. He didn't even notice. His legs were unsteady as he paced, trying to work through the chaos in his mind. A part of him wanted to go after Kim, to find her, to explain himself, but how could he? What could he say? Could he really claim innocence as if he hadn't been complicit all along? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he had never been innocent. He had just never questioned what he was told. He stopped by the window, looking out at the darkening streets, the world outside moving on, unaware of the storm that had just begun in his life. A strange feeling gripped him. A deep, gnawing sense of guilt, but also something else, something that stirred in him like a spark in dry tinder, a desire to right the wrongs. Could he take down his own father? Could he fix this mess he had allowed to happen? For the first time in years, he was making a decision for himself, not as the heir to Carter Global, not as David Carter's son, but as someone who had been lied to, used, and betrayed. His future no longer seemed like a preordained path. There were no more answers, just questions. What did he want to be now? The sound of his phone ringing broke through the silence. He glanced down at it, and for a moment, he didn't want to answer. His father, the man who had controlled his every move, every thought, every decision. James hesitated. His finger hovered over the screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't want to face his father. He couldn't. Not yet. He put the phone down, his mind made up. There was something he needed to do first. He had to face the truth, all of it, and that meant confronting his father. But first, he needed to find Kim. He needed to hear her side, to understand everything she had gone through. The anger in her eyes had shaken him. He had to make things right, even if that meant dismantling everything his father had built. And so as the darkness outside deepened, James Carter made a choice. He would confront David Carter. He would confront the empire of lies. And somehow, he would make it right. But would it be enough? James didn't know. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to find out. The heavy wooden door of David Carter's private office closed with a quiet click. But inside, the air felt charged with a tension that could have sparked a fire. James Carter stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the sprawling cityscape outside, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. His heart was pounding. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he awaited the confrontation that was inevitable, the moment he had dreaded for so long, but now had no choice but to face. Behind him, the door opened slowly, and David Carter entered his presence, filling the room like a storm cloud. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor, a sound that seemed to amplify the mounting pressure between father and son. For a moment, David didn't speak, but the silence was suffocating. James could feel it, that oppressive weight of years of unspoken truths, buried lies, and the invisible chains that had bound him to a man who had never allowed him to think for himself. "James, you wanted to talk." David's voice was cold, detached like the man he had always been, proud, arrogant, and ruthless. But there was something different in his tone today, something almost defensive. His eyes flickered toward James, his expression unreadable, but there was a faint sense of impatience beneath the surface, as if he knew what was coming and resented it. James turned away from the window, his gaze locking with his father's. For a moment, he was taken aback by the realization that he had never truly looked at this man, the man who had raised him, molded him, and built an empire on his shoulders. And now, for the first time in his life, he could see it all clearly, the mask, the power, the manipulation. "I've heard some things," Father James said, his voice steady, though there was a tremor beneath it that he couldn't control. "Things about the Carter family, about the land in Florida, about what you've done." David's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He already knew where this conversation was headed, and in his mind, it wasn't a conversation at all. It was a matter of control. "What have you heard?" he asked, his tone dismissive, almost patronizing. "You know better than to listen to rumors. What Kim Harris says, what she's claiming. It's all lies, James." James's stomach twisted at the sound of Kim's name on his father's lips. The contempt in David's voice made his skin crawl, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't here for an argument. He was here for answers. I'm not talking about rumors. James's voice grew firmer, his pulse quickening. I've seen the documents. I've seen the evidence. You didn't just take the land. You stole it. You used your power, your connections to erase people's lives. My mother, Imani Harris. She didn't die in an accident, did she? You made her disappear. David's face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The mask slipped just for a moment, but it was enough for James to see the truth. His father wasn't the man James had always idolized. The man standing before him was someone he barely recognized, someone capable of anything to keep his empire intact. That's a serious accusation, James David said, his tone dropping into something darker. And I don't think you know what you're talking about. He stepped closer, his stature imposing like a predator circling its prey. Imani Harris was a nobody. She was nothing more than an obstacle. And if she had to disappear to protect the future of Carter Global, then so be it. That's how business works, son. You should know that by now. James recoiled as though he had been slapped. The coldness in his father's voice hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. The truth was clear now. David didn't regret a thing. He had made a choice, and that choice had been to destroy anyone who stood in his way. To him, people were disposable. James stood frozen, his mind reeling. The words that had once made sense, the way his father had always justified his actions as part of the greater good, now felt hollow, empty. And beneath all the years of training, of manipulation, of being told that this was the only way, something inside him snapped. He wasn't that man. No, Dad. I don't think I do know what I'm talking about. James's voice dropped, becoming low and dangerous. But I do know this. He paused, the words heavy on his tongue. You're wrong, and you always have been. David's face flushed, his expression tightening with anger. How dare you, he began, but James cut him off, his voice gaining strength. No, you listen to me. James stepped forward, his eyes burning with a new kind of fire. All these years, I've lived in your shadow. I've been a part of this family's empire, doing whatever you told me to, because I thought that was what was right. But now, he paused, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Now I realize what's been right in front of me all along. David was silent, his eyes narrowing, but there was an edge of uncertainty creeping into his stance. James could see it now. His father was vulnerable, and that made him feel powerful. The son was no longer the pawn. I don't care about the money. James continued, the words flowing now, unimpeded. I don't care about this company, this empire you've built. What I care about is the truth, and I can't stand by you anymore. Not after everything I've seen. Not after what I've heard from Kim. Not after learning about what you've done to my own blood. For the first time in what felt like forever, James was free. The shackles of his father's influence, the lies he had been told, the legacy he had been forced to uphold, they were all slipping away. David stared at his son, his face pale with shock, anger, and something else, fear. You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can just turn your back on your own family, on your future? His voice cracked a rare slip in his otherwise perfect composure. James didn't flinch. I'm not turning my back on my family. I'm turning my back on you. For a moment there was silence, a silence that stretched thick with the weight of James's decision. His father's world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. James had chosen the truth, and nothing, not even his father's rage, could take that back. The disappointment in David's eyes was like a blade, but it didn't pierce James. It didn't break him. I'll never be a part of this again, Dad. James said, his voice final, unwavering. This ends today. As James turned to leave, his heart raced not with fear, but with freedom. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was making the right choice. The hard choice, but the right one. Behind him, David stood motionless, his entire empire now fragile and crumbling. For once, he was the one left in the dust. The son had chosen a different path, and James knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The sun beat down on the crowd gathered at the construction site for the much-anticipated Florida Rising development. The land that had once been her family's, the land her mother had loved and fought for, was about to be erased under the guise of progress. The sleek, modern buildings, the luxury shopping centers, and the sprawling residential blocks would soon stand where her childhood memories had once lived. Kim stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her heart hammered in her chest, but it was no longer fear that drove her. It was something much more powerful. Determination. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for, the moment where she would finally expose the truth that had been buried for so long. She glanced over at James Carter standing beside her, his face pale and tight, with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. He had made the decision he was standing with her, not his father. This was no longer just her fight. It was his too. And that thought alone sent a surge of power through her. The two of them were about to face the very empire James's father had built, a foundation built on lies and deceit, and they were going to tear it down. Kim couldn't help but feel a rush of pride as she looked at him. For so long he had been the enemy, the man who had turned his back on her family, the man whose name was tied to the pain and suffering she had lived through. But now he was no longer just James Carter, CEO of Carter Global. He was James Monroe, the man who had made a choice to do what was right, to stand by the woman he had wronged. Kim's breath hitched for a moment, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her, but she pushed them back. There was no time for weakness. This was her moment. She was going to take it. The camera flashes lit up the sky as the crowd began to cheer. James, ever the public figure, stepped forward, first ready to deliver his speech as planned. But Kim wasn't going to wait. This wasn't going to be a moment of polite applause and business as usual. This was her fight, and she was going to take the mic herself. As James stepped up to the podium, Kim took a deep breath and moved past him, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement with each step. The sound was almost deafening in the otherwise hushed environment. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her, but she didn't flinch. She was used to being underestimated, used to being ignored. But today was different. Today she was no longer just a mechanic or a mother. Today she was the one with the power, the truth, and the evidence to expose the very foundation of Carter Global's empire. Kim reached the podium, her eyes locking on to the sea of faces before her. The room fell silent, sensing that something was about to change. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kim began, her voice strong, unwavering, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. She took a moment to let the silence settle around her. "I have something that the Carter family doesn't want you to know, something they've kept hidden for years." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. James stood frozen beside her, unsure of what she was about to say, but knowing deep down that this was the moment that everything would change. Kim's eyes never left the crowd, but she felt James's gaze on her, and she could feel his presence beside her. There was a sense of solidarity now, a sense that they were in this together. And it was all thanks to her courage, her resolve, and the undeniable truth she had in her hands. The land that is about to be developed for this so-called Florida Rising project, she continued her voice now. Hard with the weight of the truth, does not belong to the Carter family. It belongs to my family. It was stolen from us. And it wasn't just stolen. It was taken, forged, manipulated, and hidden under lies so deep that no one could see the truth. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Kim could see the way some people glanced at each other as if trying to understand what was happening. But there was no mistaking her words. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. Kim reached into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of documents. She slammed them onto the podium with a sharp thud, the sound like thunder in the air. She watched as people recoiled the force of her gesture, snapping them into attention. "These documents," she said, "show the manipulation, the lies, the fraud committed by David Carter, the father of the man standing beside me today. These documents show the forged death certificates, the land deeds, the signatures, and the fake records that allowed the Carters to take what was never theirs." James's face turned ashen. His heart was hammering in his chest, but this time he didn't flinch. This wasn't about his empire, his father, or his reputation anymore. This was about the truth. This was about Kim. This was about making it right. "I'm not here to destroy what your family has built," Kim went on, her eyes now fixed on James. "I'm here to tear down the lies, and I'm here to bring back what's ours." She took another step forward, her voice rising with the weight of the years of struggle that had brought her to this moment. "You want to build something here, Carters. You want to claim this land as your own. Then you will first have to face the consequences of your actions. You will face the truth of what you've done to my family, to me, to my mother." The crowd was silent now, the weight of her words settling on everyone like a thick, suffocating fog. Kim could feel her pulse in her throat, but she didn't let the intensity of the moment distract her. She had come this far, and she was not backing down now. James stood there, his heart racing, his mind in turmoil. He could feel the weight of his father's sins bearing down on him, and for the first time in his life, he felt the truth of it. The unbearable guilt of being a part of this world, a world that had stolen, manipulated, and controlled. His chest tightened as Kim's words washed over him. He was torn between the man he had been raised to be and the man he wanted to become. And in that moment, with the entire world watching, James made his choice. He stepped forward, his voice unsteady but resolute. "My father did this. He is the one who built this empire on lies. I didn't know, but I know now. And I stand with Kim Harris. I stand with the truth. I'm not part of this anymore. I renounce my name and everything my father built." The gasps that followed were loud, but Kim didn't flinch. She stood tall, her heart racing as she heard the words she'd been waiting to hear. James Carter, the heir to the Carter fortune, had just declared himself a traitor to his own blood. The crowd was stunned. There was a moment of pure, unadulterated shock, but then it began the slow build of applause. At first, hesitant, unsure. But as more people understood what was happening, the applause grew louder. It was a small victory, but it was theirs. Kim stood there side by side with James, her head held high. They had both made their stand. Together they had made the truth known to the world. And it was just the beginning. As the applause died down, Kim's heart settled. She had done it. She had exposed the lies and given her family the justice they deserved. And while she knew there was still a long road ahead today, had been a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed, ignored, or trampled by those in power. James stood beside her, the weight of the world still heavy on his shoulders, but the weight of his father's influence no longer holding him captive. He was free, and Kim was the one who had helped him find that freedom. The battle wasn't over, but in this moment justice had prevailed, and Kim Harris would never again be underestimated. The headlines hit like a tidal wave. James Carter and Kim Harris stood united, their faces splashed across the front pages of every major newspaper and magazine in the country. The weight of their words, their decision to go public with the truth about the Carter family's crimes, shook the foundations of society. The public's reaction was immediate, raw, and relentless. Protests erupted in cities from coast to coast. People marched, their voices raised in outrage against the Carter family's exploitation and the powerful figures who had long manipulated the system. Signs bearing Kim's face and James's name flashed in the crowds, their unity symbolizing a shift, a rebellion against the oppression that had defined their lives for far too long. It was no longer just about a stolen land or a broken promise. It was about something much bigger, justice, truth, and accountability. Inside the gleaming cold walls of Carter Global, David Carter fumed. His empire, built on decades of manipulation, was crumbling before his eyes. The press had turned against him, and the entire world now questioned the legitimacy of everything he had ever built. He could feel the walls closing in. The whispers, the accusations, the faces that had once smiled and praised him now turned their backs. The weight of his own lies was suffocating. But David would not back down. He had weathered storms before. He would weather this one too. With a sneer on his face, he prepared for the one thing he knew would allow him to maintain control: a press conference. He would speak directly to the public, make his case, and turn the tide in his favor. The room was already buzzing with reporters' cameras snapping and microphones poised to catch every word. David stood tall at the podium, his expression calm but hardened. His eyes darted briefly to the side, catching the nervous glances of his legal team. They were just as tense, their anxiety palpable. But David, for all his arrogance, was unshaken. He would lie his way out of this just as he had done countless times before. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," he began, his voice smooth, polished, and full of authority. "I stand before you today to address the blatant lies and accusations made against me and my family by Kim Harris and her accomplice, James Carter. These claims, these outrageous allegations, are nothing more than a calculated attempt to destroy our name and legacy." He paused for a moment, allowing the reporters to digest his words. A flash of anger flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly masked. He knew what to say next, and he said it with conviction. "Kim Harris claims that my company stole land from her family. That is not only false, but it is also slanderous. She accuses me of having a hand in the death of her mother, Imani Harris. But the real truth is that Imani Harris tragically died in a car accident while chasing after me." David's voice faltered only slightly, but just enough to show the cracks in his carefully constructed narrative. "She was obsessed, and when I rejected her, she couldn't handle it." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as if to drive home his point, his words dripping with disdain. Kim Harris has fabricated this entire story in an attempt to gain sympathy to rewrite history. I am innocent of these charges and I have done nothing wrong. The reporters murmured among themselves, some looking skeptical, but David was certain his words would be enough. He could see the headlines forming in their minds. The public would be convinced. He would not let his empire fall. But just as David was about to continue, the doors to the press room slammed open. All eyes snapped to the figure that entered it was Imani Harris, Kim's mother, alive and standing before them, her face filled with fierce determination. For a moment, there was absolute silence. David's face drained of color, the arrogance evaporating in an instant. Imani Harris, the woman he had believed dead for years, was standing in front of him, her eyes locked onto his with an unflinching gaze. Kim had kept her promise. "You liar." Imani's voice cut through the air, cold and unyielding. She didn't waste a second. "You didn't reject me. You murdered me." Gasps filled the room as the weight of her words sank in. Imani stepped forward, her voice rising with fury. "David Carter orchestrated my disappearance. He had me silenced so that he could steal what was mine, my land, my legacy, and my family's future. And now he has the audacity to stand before you and call me a victim of my own obsession." Imani's hand shook with righteous anger as she held up a series of documents. "These papers right here prove everything. These are the medical records, the official reports, the signed affidavits from the people who helped you erase me. These are the lies you've been living on. And today it ends." Kim stood at the back of the room watching the scene unfold. Her heart swelled with pride. Her mother was alive, and she was taking back everything David had stolen. For so long, Kim had carried the weight of believing her mother was gone, but now she had her back, and together they were going to make David Carter pay for everything he had done. "You took everything from me, David." Imani's voice was fierce, unyielding, but there was a softness in her eyes as she turned to Kim. "But you gave me back my voice, and for that, I'll never be able to repay you." Kim felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly, stepping forward to stand beside her mother. Together they were stronger. Together they were unbreakable. David stood frozen, his face ashen. The evidence was irrefutable. His empire was crumbling. His world, the one built on lies and manipulation, was falling apart. The press, once loyal to him, now turned against him. The tide had shifted, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the police arrived, their sirens cutting through the air, David was arrested. The charges were piling up: forgery, manslaughter, and fraud. His world, his legacy, was now in the hands of the very people he had sought to crush. The media swarmed around him as he was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. Kim felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. The fight was over. The truth had been exposed, and David Carter was going to pay for his crimes. But even more than that, she had reclaimed her family's legacy. She turned to James, her eyes filled with gratitude. He had stood by her side against everything he had ever known to fight for the truth. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you." James nodded, his expression calm, but filled with a quiet strength. "We did it together." He had found peace in knowing he had done the right thing. He had turned his back on his father's empire and chosen a path of truth, of integrity. He had lost his wealth, his name, and his legacy, but he had gained something far more valuable: his freedom. The press conference was over, but the battle was far from won. Kim and James stood side by side, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. They had won the fight for their family, and now they were going to rebuild. Kim was no longer burdened by the weight of revenge. She had fought for justice, and justice had been served. Now she would work to restore the land that had been stolen, to build a future for Naomi, and to honor the memory of the family she had lost. And for the first time in a long while, Kim felt a deep, unshakable peace settle in her heart. She had fought for the truth, and the truth had finally set her free. A week later, the small shop door swung open, a soft chime echoing through the still morning air. The familiar scent of motor oil, rubber, and steel filled the space, but there was something new now. A sense of hope hung thick in the air. The once dusty, abandoned workshop was now a place of transformation, not just for cars, but for lives. Kim Harris stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on a rag, a small smile tugging at her lips as she looked around the space she had built from nothing. The walls of Monroe Auto Works, the shop that had once been a reminder of everything she had lost, were now adorned with new banners. "Empowerment through work" was painted in bold letters above the workstations. Every tool on the wall, every engine part scattered across the benches had a purpose now. They weren't just instruments of labor, they were tools of change. She wasn't just fixing cars, she was fixing lives. She had created opportunities for young people in her community, people who had been forgotten, dismissed by a system that had no use for them. Kim gave them a chance just as she had once been given by her Uncle Luther. She didn't just teach them to repair engines, she taught them to rebuild themselves. One by one, young men and women came in uncertain at first, but leaving with a sense of purpose, a sense of pride. She would never forget the day she had been shown the same compassion by Luther, and now she was passing that gift on. Every day, a new challenge, a new opportunity, and with each challenge, Kim grew stronger. Stronger in her conviction, stronger in her belief that this community had the power to heal itself. Stronger in the knowledge that she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. James Carter stood by the workbench, his hands expertly turning wrenches and tightening bolts. Gone were the days of expensive suits, high-rise offices, and the life of privilege that had once defined him. He had shed all of that along with the identity his father had forced upon him. Now, standing in the heart of Monroe Auto Works, he was truly free. Looking around at the young men and women working alongside him, James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He was no longer just a man with money and a name. He had become part of something real, something that mattered. His hands weren't just clean, neatly polished from boardroom meetings anymore. They were scarred and rough, but they were honest. His past had been full of ambition and control, but now he had found something even more valuable: purpose. He looked across the room at Kim, and his heart swelled. She was everything to him. She had always been. Her strength, her passion, her fight for justice had pulled him out of the darkness. She had given him a second chance, not just at love, but at life. It had been a year since the press conference, since David Carter's empire fell. Since then, everything had changed, but not just for Kim. James had changed too. He had left behind the gilded cage of his past and embraced a new life, a new mission. And the more time he spent with Kim, the more he realized how much he wanted to share this life with her, to stand beside her as an equal, not as a man with a past to hide, but as a man with a future to build. One evening after the shop had closed for the day, Kim and James sat on the porch of the shop, watching the sunset cast long shadows over the town. The weight of everything that had come before, the betrayals, the pain, the loss, all seemed so distant now. They had fought for justice, and now they had a chance to live for something greater than just themselves. Kim took a deep breath, feeling the cool air of the evening. She had dreamed of this moment of rebuilding, of giving people hope. But there was something else she hadn't anticipated, something that had crept up on her over time. She had found love, again love, with a man who had once been a stranger and who now felt like home. James turned to her, his gaze soft but steady. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a deep, heartfelt emotion he couldn't quite contain. "Kim, there's something I need to say." His voice was thick with sincerity, a depth of emotion that made her heart race. He paused for a moment, his gaze drifting down to the ring on her finger, the one that had once symbolized a promise long forgotten. Kim met his eyes, her expression calm but full of warmth. She had already given him so much: her trust, her forgiveness, her heart. But she could tell from the look on his face that he was about to ask for something she had not anticipated. Her pulse quickened, but her smile remained steady. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I know I've hurt you, hurt us. But I want to make things right. I want to be the man you need me to be, the man I've always wanted to be." He took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. "Kim, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you and everything you've given me?" Kim's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected this, but at the same time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She had never been one to live in the past, but as she looked at James now, this man, who had once been an outsider, a stranger, she realized that he had become her partner, her equal, the love of her life. "Yes, James. Yes, I'll marry you." Her voice was soft, but her words were full of certainty. She reached out, taking his hands in hers, the ring still glinting in the fading light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, just holding each other's gaze, letting the weight of their shared history settle between them. For Kim, this was more than just a proposal. It was the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, and everything she had built. She was no longer a woman who had been broken by her past. She was a woman who had rebuilt her future. And now she was going to build it with James, with Naomi, with the community they had nurtured. A few weeks later, they stood before their friends, their family, and their community. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Kim in a modest white dress, her natural hair flowing freely, her smile radiating more than just joy. It was a smile of triumph. James by her side, no longer in a tailored suit, but in something far more meaningful, a symbol of his new life, his new purpose. As they exchanged vows, Kim couldn't help but think of everything they had overcome, the lies, the betrayal, the pain, and how it had all led them here, to this moment together. And in that moment, with the world watching them, Kim and James promised to build something that would last. Not just a marriage, but a legacy of justice, love, and redemption. Kim's dream had come true. Monroe Auto Works wasn't just a place to fix cars anymore. It was a beacon of hope, a place where people could find purpose, community, and the opportunity to change their lives. James, by her side, had found his new purpose too. Together they created projects that would rebuild the community, replace the past with a brighter future, and make sure that what was taken from them would never be forgotten. Kim had found happiness in a way she had never imagined, not because she had it all, but because she had the right people around her. People she had helped, and people who had helped her. She had rebuilt her world piece by piece, and in doing so, she had found something more precious than revenge or justice. She had found peace. The story of Kim and James is one of redemption, strength, and the power of justice. Kim's journey from pain and betrayal to triumph shows us that no matter the obstacles, it's possible to rebuild and reclaim what was taken. Her courage, combined with James's transformation, reminds us all that standing up for what's right and following our heart can lead to unimaginable strength. Kim's story proves that the real power comes from within, from resilience, truth, and the ability to do what's right, even when the world is against you. If you've ever faced challenges in your life, whether it's standing up for what's right or overcoming adversity, we want to hear from you. How would you have reacted if you were in Kim's position? How do you find the strength to move forward when it seems like everything is falling apart? If you found Kim and James's story inspiring, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Let's spread the message of justice, love, and inner strength to everyone. Thank you for being part of this journey and for your support in bringing these powerful stories to life.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.